Hello, and welcome to episode 79, I believe, of the Following Mechanical Turks project. We're still in the stages of developing the third product, following the first product's text mining investigation, the second product's surveys, where we posted tasks on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, revolving around producing readable summaries. And now we're heading into the third piece, which has a more theoretical approach, where we are attempting to ascertain how Amazon's Mechanical Turk and hybrids like it theorize, what human is through its operations. We've gone through sort of a lot of different shifts with this third piece in terms of what its focus might be, how it's grounded. In part, that's just developments of the other pieces, but it's also particularly responsive to contemporary changes in things like generative AI. We've been doing this project, I think, over 5 years at this point. And so the ground regarding generative AI has changed considerably. Not honestly, it's if you were following this, it's not a radical departure from where things were going, but there have been punctuated changes in things like notably ChatGPT, where it's one of those things where it's things were like this, but I think, as William Gibson said, they weren't evenly distributed.
Yeah.
The sort of semi-public access offered to ChatGPT did change quite a bit, particularly in, the academic space, but also the employment space,
Yeah.
So those things are, necessarily, driving what it is that we're doing. So in this third piece, we're still sort of collecting our thoughts in terms of what the shape of that is going to be. And we are talking to guest experts to kind of help direct that process. That's kind of the gist of where we are. Am I skipping over anything?
No, that was a nice tight summary. That was good.
Well, I can't talk much.
That helps. I think it's good that we do these in the morning when we're too groggy to really get out of control. Yeah. So, I've been puzzling over that. In part, I sent to you that Annette V, who was our guest last time, also has a recently published edited collection on generative text that was sort of in the work, similar to this project, right? Sort of aware of this stuff in the works, but the timing of that one's actually quite, they nailed the timing on that book coming out. And then I sent it to you and you asked, I think the always important question, which is what is this doing that, or what are we doing that just isn't this? Which is, I think kind of the other end of the question we're thinking about, which is it's related to the question of who's the audience for what this piece might be. But also, thinking about that question is also, now what do we have to offer that audience that isn't already, not that it has to be totally radically new, but are we offering anything unique to this conversation that's unique because it's grounded, as you were talking about, in the first two things that we did. And what's interesting about this is a lot of these are assignment basis. So each of these is sort of an assignment, more or less, that's organized around these particular areas, which I think makes it really. What's that?
Well, yeah, it seems to have this sort of pedagogical focus.
Yeah. And so what that got me thinking about is oh, I lost the thread there. Is that one of the going back to the kind of thinking about this as a theoretical piece that is in fact the audience we have in mind, or the conversation we have in mind, that pedagogically oriented one? Or are we more, to tease at an age-old split in our field, right? Is this a rhetoric project or a composition project, with all caveats about the slash between those things?
Yeah.
That it strikes me that the pedagogical aspects of it seem to be nicely covered, right? Like so thinking more about what should or could rhetoric be thinking about this? Like, what does this mean for rhetorical theory?
Yeah.
It isn't immediately reducible to writing and the generation of texts. Because readability, I think, has lots of resonances in other areas. And in particular, I mean, part of this is because we've used the concept of the rhetorical situation, we've used the concept of the taskscape, but in part because this coincides with this semester I'm teaching my public rhetoric class, and the way that I've over the time started to articulate that course, because typically I'll get a smart ass student that wants to know when I'm teaching private rhetoric, right? That what is it about public rhetoric? What do you mean by that? And the sort of the argument of the course is, this is a class that's about creating publics in which particular rhetoric becomes possible, right? So it's not about rhetoric done publicly, but how do you think about the kind of rhetoric that's done that makes the kind of more obvious explicit persuasion possible, right? So instead of thinking about, right, my earnest undergraduates typically want to know how to do it, which is like, what's the magic way I can arrange my discourse so that results in persuasion, right? But leaving unexplored, right? Well, how do you get a venue to talk in the first place, right? How does your language at all resonate with anybody, right? That's because there's some prior rhetorical work. So this week I actually had him read excerpts from Frederick Douglass's autobiography, where he describes traveling around the country trying to find venues in which he can speak. Whereas most rhetorical treatises written at the same time are solely devoted to how you arrange your discourse, because they don't have to worry about,
Right.
Cable, Watley, and Blair can talk about audience because they presume that there'll be people there listening to them that don't want to. So kind of thinking about, right, how is this particular taskscape and notions of readability not just what is it writing, but what kinds of human intelligence tasks is it generating? I mean, this goes back to our kind of our opening question with the first piece. Is like, what does mechanical Turks think intelligence is? And then that became specifically into, okay, what does it think, readability and trauma are? And then the second piece was, okay, how do we cultivate particular readabilities? So maybe one direction that's not, I don't think, a radical break from what we've been talking about before, but what kinds of rhetorical situations are being generated by mechanical Turk-like systems, and readability is in another, right? How does it? And this goes back to something you were talking about earlier, right? The idea of, and this is something I think we played around with some of the stuff that we cut from the second piece, which is that whole train of, in orality, the base unit is the phoneme or the word. In literacy, it's the written word. And in something like digitality, maybe it's we're the thing that's read. So I don't know. It was kind of thinking about maybe moving away from the idea that we'd be speaking to the kind of compositional concerns around writing and how its ability to generate texts is something we need to think through, and more the concerns of rhetorical theory, which are more in terms of, relationality, sociality, which is also potentially right the labor stuff that we've talked about, the ethics stuff, right? All that gets wrapped into there. So I think kind of coming back around to what you kicked around before, which is a kind of theoretical piece that builds from the theory that we think these systems are doing. And then the idea is that particular concepts in rhetorical theory are especially productive at tying all those things together when they otherwise look like disparate elements of this, right? So you've got something like text generation, you have the whole quandary about, is it human or not? You have the quandary about the labor that's involved in it, right? All these kind of things that look like they're potentially distinct areas or even disciplines. And is there something about rhetorical theory that allows them to be, thought about, not simultaneously, but thought about in a more sort of holistic, integrated way?
Yeah, I mean, referring back to our conversation with Annette V, kind of one of the takeaways, I think when we asked her, like, how do you think we should approach this? It seemed like her position was kind of an appeal to other disciplines about why rhetoric belongs in this conversation,
Yeah.
And we talked about that because it also speaks to audience, who is this actually for? I thought that was an interesting position. I was interested or, hesitant in part because it wasn't clear how we would position this third piece. I mean, I guess you could do it, but it's like, now this is for outsiders, which would mean also it's like, so the expectation presumably isn't that you're familiar with the previous ones, that those who may have read the previous ones would be interested in this third one. I mean, it's an approach. It was interesting to me in part because it's like it would be kind of a big shift into, and now we need to speak to a kind of external audience that's
Right.
skeptical. It is kind of interesting also because it's like, most disciplinary scholarship isn't outward focused in that way.
Yeah.
In what discipline in their flagship journal, what percentage of pieces are not for them? Where it's like,
Right.
I realize the venue, but this is for other people who don't have, so it's even like, I talk to students about this in terms of jargon. Every piece in a biology journal doesn't start with, and when I say biology, here's what I'm talking about. And when I say cell, this is, it's because they know this, right? Everything is jargon. Everything is a metonym. It's just, it's a question of, does your audience, how are they coming along with you or not, right?
Yeah. Although it does strike me, I mean, two things about what you just said is that oftentimes I do feel that that's less true of rhetoric journals, where sometimes I'll read a piece in I put pieces in RSQ where I'm like, I actually think this is probably better served for the people doing the thing I'm talking about. Not like, if we're going to write a piece about environmental rhetoric, maybe RSQ is, anyway, so there's that, right? I think somebody's read, and also rhetoric will actually have to spend the first 5 pages saying, okay, now when I say situation, I actually mean this, not this. See the next 4 footnotes. But anyway, I also got me thinking about, as you were talking about that, like, is this even the idea of, would the third piece be hosted alongside the other two, or would it be actually a piece we would try to send someplace else? I mean, I don't think we should potentially do that, but it even got to that point, right? Where what's for a different audience, where's how do you get it in front of them other than,
Where
Twitter?
would that be? Because I mean,
Right.
that's sort of an age-old, perhaps chicken and egg problem, where it's like, what is a genuinely cross-disciplinary journal
Yeah.
and or non-disciplinary journal? And it's like, to an extent, well, that's a phantom. It doesn't exist. A lot of them have those pretensions, but then what it really means is this field, but written at a level that others potentially could.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, just in part because of the way, disciplinary structures work, publishing, where it's like, okay, well, who are the managing editors, right? Who's the sponsoring
Yeah.
institution? Those things don't
Yeah.
come from nowhere. And so
Right.
there's a question about, like, who is this for? And if you don't have a solid answer to that, then often the answer is, well, then nobody, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, the big one would be the theory, culture, and society. They did a special issue on cultural technique. Um, Bernard, who we had on, is published there. So, I mean, that would be that's a
And that, right? I mean, it's like, even those places, it's like, okay, well, that's who's interested in this? Theorists. It's like, even those,
yeah, yeah,
there
yeah,
is nothing that's for everybody. As much as that, that's the default answer for, who is this for? Well, it could be for anybody. No, it couldn't, right?
yeah. No,
Who is it actually for? I mean, in that case, it's like, well, theorists, fine, fine, and I mean, that's an option.
theorists are people too.
Huh. We'd want to know about things like, okay, well, then what do they value? What are their betting mechanisms?
Yeah,
Yeah, you recently asked, or no, you or Ryan or somebody was like, would you prefer a disengaged audience or an
yeah,
antagonistic one, right? And like, I've had antagonistic audiences, particularly of philosophers, right? I was
yeah,
blindsided, but it's like, oh, I thought we were on the same team, but it turns out not.
yeah. Uh,
I bring it up because it's like, is a venue like that, is an audience like that, one you need to go into with your eyes open.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think too, also, yeah. I mean, I think a lot hinges on,
The red wheelbarrow.
yes, so much depends.
Not really.
Yeah, not yeah. Shut up, William. Shut up, Willie. You know what you're talking about. Go fix somebody. Lost that thought. Have you got Burke off the drink yet? Okay. Yeah, because the audience question too is we also don't want to. I mean, the other sort of, and I think Annette was on this too, is that the sort of caveat of that approach is you also don't want to. We come in as antagonistic, like, oh, you guys, you're missing out. You're missing out
Yeah.
because you don't have this rhetoric thing. I mean, which is demonstrably true. Is every time I read somebody that's interesting in philosophy, I'm like, yeah, no, you just, I was reading something the other day, and I'm like, yeah, you don't have to go back to the 18th century for this. You can go back to like Heraclitus was on this, guys. Anyway, but yeah, too. So kind of how to thread that needle in terms of the kind of claims you want to make, the intensity of those claims, and then who you think would be receptive to them versus who you think could, right? I mean, even the question of like, who could benefit from our ideas is always potentially a question that will come across as antagonistic to a certain audience.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about this, right, with respect to, are we talking to computer science people who, I mean, even the Turkers themselves, right? The idea of couple of humanists wading in to set things right is never a particularly popular approach for many reasons to which I'm sympathetic.
Right.
You know,
This is emerging for me right now because, and I think I've touched upon this before, but like my institution, this is due Tuesday. They sent after some preliminary gestures, they sent basically sort of like I'm assuming faculty, but institution-wide email about, we're putting together this group, this advisory group about generative AI. If you want to be a part of it, fill out this application, right? So, I'm gonna, but it's also like, I'm already taking notes, and a lot of those notes are, here's why you need us there.
Yeah.
And, it's not galling, but that's an argument that computer science isn't going to have to make. It's like, why not? Why is the default, this is a technocratic problem, rather than, well, we're writing teachers, you should have started with us. That's what this is about.
No, there is, part of me is like, well, that's a meeting I don't have to go to. Like, no one thought to email the director of the writing program.
And
I wouldn't have thoughts on this. I have many thoughts.
Anyway,
I have 80 episodes of thoughts, actually, if you really want to.
Part of my argument is that it's like, I am doing a research project that's related to this, and have been for years. Like, that's the other thing, is like, this didn't come from nowhere. People have been tracing this for, well, the roots of this are at least a decade old.
Yeah.
Anyway, so a couple of things. One is, that piece is already burdened by the fact that of expectations, that it's like, it's already trying to do too much. We haven't even started it yet. And it's already trying to do too much. I'll have to make some choices there. Some of the things that are in our notes that I thought were useful were like concepts, like, artifice is something that has been a kind of controlling concept for this piece, at least in the last couple of months. Because I can still see your feet. It's sort of like other concepts popped out of the previous pieces, right? Sort of controlling concepts in terms of readability, trauma, taskate. And I like the idea of a controlling concept. So it gives you an answer to, it's like, well, what is this about? Then you have an answer where it's like, well, it's about artifice in these ways, or about how artifice is a useful concept to thread the needle among these seemingly different concepts, right? Or these seemingly different instances of things, where it's like, you look at these examples, what's the connective tissue? And it's like, oh, for us, we see it as artifice.
Well, I like that too. Because that's where I still need to type these up. We'll see. This is the reason this is the notebook I keep by my bed for thoughts, and I've got some art. I have some ideas, my precious ideas.
Does it only exist in print?
Yeah, I got to type it up.
Oh, you better get to it. You had a house fire.
Wow.
I'm just saying. Just saying.
Just saying.
I'm just saying it could happen again.
Oh God.
Just saying, media have their weaknesses.
Yeah. But what I like about that too is what it would be about is artifice, and then rhetoric we bring in, because rhetoric helps us talk about artifice.
Right.
So in that sense, we're not bringing rhetoric to the rescue. We have pulled out of this discourse that we're all involved in, the term artificial. We'd like to zero in on that term because we actually think it shouldn't be like, we shouldn't be embarrassed by it.
Mhm.
Because it suggests a lot of what's happening here, right? And there's a sense, we've talked about this, right? That if we imagine a kind of antagonists and or opponents and proponents, right? They both seem to be slightly embarrassed by the term artifice, or they'd rather it not, right? That even people working in AI are working towards it being really intelligent as opposed to artificially so.
Hmm.
And then critics of it are basically, it's artificial, not truly so. So as we've kind of pointed out, right, there's ways in which they sort of share some sort of ontological position about what intelligence is, where we think you could actually leverage artifice, as you just pointed out, to bring some of these disparate conversations together. And then as folks in rhetoric, rhetoric is useful because it is historically not embarrassed by artifice, but it's actually fully prepared to think through artifice. I mean, I pulled out, like, there's the great Ong quote about the most natural thing about writing is it's artificial. You know, that could be a good place to start. I was also wrote up some notes because we had Casey Boyle on, I don't know, years ago, but in his, literally, but in his postscript to rhetoric as a post-human practice, he carves out the difference between basically rhetoric's question isn't what is, rhetoric's question is which one. And so he tells probably a apocryphal story, but Kennedy gets the 2 letters from Khrushchev about the Cuban Missile Crisis. One's conciliatory and one's aggressive. And he basically asks, which one should I respond to? And then Casey sort of, like, that's rhetoric's question is never what is, it's which one. And so that could maybe thinking about what a conclusion of that piece would be is that what artifice and rhetoric helps us see is that the question is not what is intelligence, because we think that question is limited utility, right? In many ways, the answer to that question is actually not going to resolve most of what we feel are the pressing issues, right? Like, it's truly intelligent. Okay, but are we still going to be paying Kenyans 50 cents an hour to like that? That doesn't help resolve that. But which intelligence do you want potentially? Right? Do you want the kind of intelligence that requires this chain of labor to produce? And so I think maybe like not potentially outline yet, but like start with artifice and just maybe like not a lit review, but like, here's how the term artifice shows up across this discourse. And then,
or start with, not to derail, but start with artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And potentially point out it's like, and we can point to examples probably where it's like the dispute appears to center around intelligence, where people fighting about, is this a real intelligence? Here's why it's not. And even the proponents of it still doing their damnedest to minimize what they see as the artifice in order to have real intelligence. It's like, the dispute seems to be around intelligence, but the other term in there, artifice, is potentially the means to get out of that debate, not by answering it, but by just sidestepping it, where it's like, the fight you're in isn't a useful fight because it's even if you dust your hands and say we've resolved it, it's like, but you haven't gotten to those kind of thorny ethical questions. It really hasn't gotten you any farther. And that maybe then gives us entry into why artifice is the useful, pivot point here.
Yeah. And I think there's lots of stuff that we've collected that, I think if we want to, right, also avoiding kind of straw manning our opponents, I think we could find ample text evidence that opponents of it are zero in on the notion of artificial. But I also think the couple of those pieces we read about recursion, I think, are tip the hand of the proponents that are also imagining that a truly intelligent being there'll be no artifice. It'll simply be intelligent.
It'll be self-sealed in a way.
Right. So the fact that they see recursion as a problem, that's the way their embarrassment about artifice manifests itself.
Yeah, right,
And I think that means we're not, well, that's, I think, a generous reading as opposed to just assuming that they're all Cartesian.
right.
We've got receipts now that they are. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
and
but
I
there's a way to point out, it's like, we're not blaming you. It's just
know
embedded in this posture is, yeah, I mean, this assumption of it needs to be in some way hermetic for it to be
yeah.
real.
So I think we could bring a lot. I mean, I finally, not finally, it's going to sound like I was a slog, but Robin Reams's Seeming and Being in Plato's Rhetorical Theory,
Mm,
one of my favorite books. It's amazing. Long story short, that the seeming and being distinction is crucial to Plato's metaphysics. And it's mostly read as that's why he critiques rhetoric. Her argument is actually Plato's Socrates is trying to beat the sophists. And Plato invents rhetorical theory, a kind of meta-discursive thing, and then along the way ultimately reworks Greek language around mimesis and generates the distinction between seeming and being to control sophistry.
mm,
So it's actually back, if you so she does this textual analysis of all the dialogues and the things around it, that metaphysics is actually invented out of sophistic discourse. Like Socrates needs a way to beat Gorgias because he keeps losing because the sophists are really good at arguments, and he wants to win without making it about winning.
mm,
So he invents a theory of discourse that allows him to say that I can say your speech was wrong, not because I disagree with you, but because your word doesn't match on to what's really the case. But it takes him a while to do because that distinction doesn't, he has to invent that distinction. Anyway, all to say that, right, we don't blame CS people for being bothered by the term artifice. It's baked into Western metaphysics precisely to control for stochastic parrots, right?
yeah,
The idea that discourse might not be ultimately resolvable is a problem, and it turns out it's a metaphysical problem for Plato's Socrates. It also appears to be a programming problem, like that essentially you could make the argument that Socrates is ultimately he's trying to fight recursion. How do I get out of this cycle of language just keeps going and changing, and it's impossible to pin down, and the only way I can ever beat Protagoras is I have to right, don't speak in long speeches. I mean, he's literally trying to give language prompts that will allow him to compete
yeah.
without having to compete. And so in many
It
ways,
is interesting how those strictures are programmatic, right?
yeah,
It's like, these are the rules you must follow.
yeah. Socrates is creating an algorithm to beat the sophists. Like, no, that word means this, I win. Weirdly enough, on the way to do it, he has to do everything he despises, right? He makes mimesis mean what it didn't mean a week before for the Greeks. It's really the way she traces. It's like, yeah, it's sophistry all the way down.
Does
Socrates
she
has to pull all these tricks.
does she do that in Greek or in translation?
Both. She does some of the translation herself. So it's also one of the big things she does is I think this is in this piece, yeah, is that the translation of Plato referring to rhetoric as cosmetics is not quite right.
Hmm.
That he coins a neologism, and basically what it means is it means foreign. It basically means that it's foreign oils. So a lot of Plato's beefs with the sophists is that they're foreigners bringing in foreign ideas.
Yeah, well,
Hence the immigration policies of the Republic are less than ideal. But right there, he's trying to seal his discourse.
hmm,
So that could be, I mean, if we're gonna be like, okay, what does rhetoric have to offer? It will be, I was about to say hilarious, but interesting. If like, no, the first thing we're going to cite is actually a classic a classicist in rhetorical theory, working with the original Greek, because, well, she has a most recent article about post-truth, and basically says, despite what everybody's saying, the problem of post-truth is squarely anchored in Plato, not the sophists, not postmodernism. Because again, Plato wants to anchor things outside of social relations.
Yeah.
Which starts the whole, right? I mean, it kind of, it squares with me that really the problem of post-truth is the problem of individualism. Like post-truth is only a problem, right? It's the truth is socially constructed. That's not the same thing as post-truth, because post-truth ignores the social part of that.
Yeah.
Right? No, collectively we decide on this. Post-truth is anybody can have their own truth, because the truth doesn't exist socially. It exists out there, and I have access to it, which means everything else anybody says is right. So for her, that's Plato's move, right? Plato moves it out of the social and wants it to be a third party that's outside of discourse.
Right.
So surprisingly, you get a lot of post-truth stuff from people who it's almost entirely present as sociopaths, right? Like the key figure for post-truth is Trump, who nobody would assume has any kind of social communal instincts.
Right.
Anyway, but it could be interesting, right? If we want to do at least a rhetorical, historical take on artifice, it could be interesting to go back to some of those basically foundational debates for Western metaphysics, which we see as not it's not repeating itself. What's that line? History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Right? They are resonant. There's a certain sense in which this debate about artificial intelligence is another version of this debate, right? Does it seem to be intelligent, or is it really intelligent? I mean, right, that's the Turing test. And for us, it's not like we want to take a side in that, right? It's like, as I tell my students, sophists don't disagree with Plato. They don't want to have that conversation. That's an entirely different, right? These are not antagonists in the same debate. These are antagonists about which debate we should be in. And I think maybe if that's our hook, is like, we think we could be having a different debate about artificial intelligence. And here's that debate, and here's a however, right, whatever part of the article ends up being, is like, because partially it's one of the resources that we'd be offering is knowing that the conversation you're having has analogs elsewhere.
Right.
Maybe look to those analogs for ways out of this, for us, this trap of a conversation.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, so in that scenario, and this is often kind of something that's simmering. In that scenario, who is the audience then? Us, as in, like, our folk, in which case is that piece but is that piece, well, see, we're right all along?
Yeah,
I mean?
Yeah, we don't. Yeah, I mean, you're right. Do we potentially signal with the historical move? Right. Are we see what we did here? You should have believed us.
Which, is a
it's an ethos.
It's an ethos, man. Well, it's excuse me, a genre. In that case, it's like, it seems like it's for others, but it's not really.
Right.
It's an internal, we were right. Or, I mean, is there a way to shape that such that it gives us something, I mean, for example, here's what I'm doing right now in my institution, right? Would it be beneficial to have a theoretical answer to why do you belong in this conversation, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, previously you mentioned this as being pedagogical, and I was sort of, and this was a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, well, what do you mean by that? Because
Right.
because it seemed like you didn't want to do, here's a classroom assignment, right?
No.
And now this book that we looked at today looks aligned more toward that, where it's like, and here are classroom assignments.
Right.
And so if it's not that, if it's not the compret, if it's not succumbing or taking up the compret pedagogical imperative, it's like, what is it doing? And is something it's doing giving a form of answer to, here's why either we need to be in this conversation, or here's the argument you should make about, here's what this conversation needs to be. Make this argument about what this conversation should be.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I kind of like that, so that it's sort of rhetorical theory, but it's also sort of an institutional rhetoric piece.
Well, I mean, and this is not like not a contention between us, but it's like, and I've mentioned this before, it's, there are a lot of times in doing scholarship where I just get the cold sweat of the utility. It's like, what's the utility of what I'm doing,
Yeah.
Because sometimes when I'm in the weeds, it's just sort of like, is this just a diary with references? Where it's like, am I just doing this for me? It's like, what's the utility? And it's why increasingly so, over the past several years, I've turned to these things that they don't answer it really, but they sidestep that question, where it's like, well, I'm doing I text mined this corpus. And so I have like, this is what I found in doing it. Now, sure, writ large, it's like, what's the utility of it? I don't know, but it's a easier answer to like, what's the value of this? It's like, well, now we know something about this corpus in this way, right?
Right.
It's at bottom, it's probably no better of an answer, but it sidesteps it. I mean, just like you could ask a biologist, it's like, well, now we know this about the mating habits of this wasp.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, it's an answer. It has this kind of utilitarian response. And so, that kind of haunts me. And it's one thing with theoretical work where it's just like, often I feel like I can't grasp. It's like, well, what's the point of this? Which may be different than the thesis, not the claim, but it's like, yeah, but what's the point of all this?
Why the claim at all?
Yes. Why are you doing this?
Oh man.
Which, is not the thesis. Now, what are you arguing? Why are you doing this, man?
Yeah. Who do you think you are?
And I mean, in a sense, it's like, that's a bullshit question. I understand that, but it's like but like all questions, it's a bullshit question, but it's still haunting me.
Yeah, I know.
And so it's like, maybe an answer to that is, maybe it doesn't have to be super fine grained, but it's like, I mean, it's like, this is what we should be saying. And maybe that's what Annette was getting at, where it's like, this is what we should be saying.
Yeah.
It's like that, or at least this is not the only thing, but something we should be saying, which is, don't get in the weeds of this fight, because it's probably irresolvable. And even if it were, it's not going to help all that much.
No. Yeah. And maybe even too, if we're right, because we're also torn, like haunted by the question of why are we doing this? but also hesitant about coming in and making a real strong declarative statement about this is what you should be doing.
Right.
Like, well, I don't want to do that either, but I would like it to do, I would like it to have some. So I'm wondering if a way to think about it too is the article isn't necessarily directly saying you should make this argument, but perhaps it could say, well, here is an article out of which a couple of different kinds of arguments could emerge, so that we see it as a kind of theoretical it's a resource that's theory. So from this theoretical arrangement of this issue, particular arguments could get made. So rather than coming in and saying, here's the words you should use, right? Like, here's some boilerplate, but it could be, here's a theoretical framework from which then other institutional or even pedagogical arguments could get made. And that way our audience is whoever our audience, I mean, partially too, the audience question is, this is a sort of free floating project. So the audience for this is, I would hope, people who we've had on, which represent different fields. So, maybe the folks that we've had on are oftentimes generous in their retweets. So, because it's not going into a field specific journal, which, who knows?
Well, and shit, I let go of the thread. Shit. Vamp for a second, it'll come.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, because I think that can be a way that theory works. It doesn't necessarily get applied. It can get sort of, use cases. Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, because one potential thing is the exigence. I mean, if the question is, why are you doing this? Exigence is often at least the sort of proximal answer, where it's like, well, because of this, right?
Right.
Here's what's inspiring this. So, I mean, I wonder if, and this may be context, I don't know if we have to do it, but maybe context, which is like, the reason why we're doing this is there's a certain kind of what now moment. So like you were talking about in your institution, at least other parts of the institution asking things like, well, how do we manage our placement tests?
Yeah.
When it seems like now they've been completely undercut, right? And perhaps the answer they want, as the institution often does, is technocratic, which is, we'll pay, turn it in.
Yeah.
Or, well, no, you just have to do them live, and there's going to be a video camera monitoring them so that they can't consult outside sources, right? I mean, it's, it's retreat into Plato, where it's, well, you can't consult anything outside of your squishy brain. Right?
Yeah.
We've often seen, or we've also seen a similar move where I've heard what are basically neo-medieval calls to, it's like, okay, well, then I'm not going to ask them to write anymore. We're doing basically in class, we're basically doing oral disputation now. Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like, you just have to do it in class, either in a blue book or I'm going to talk to you. My critique is the institution does not give teachers that degree of agency to make calls like, I didn't like the way he talked to me.
No, nor, and pedagogically, so who's going to train them in oral disputation?
Right. Yeah.
That's a skill that's separate from their mastery of the. You get that's a skill separate of their. Someone could have mastered the material and still fuck that up, because oral disputation is a particular skill and habit that you're not going to teach your students.
Well, and in my institution, that's the split between writing and communications is basically, is it written down or are they talking? That's our disciplinary split.
Yep.
But anyway, it's like, so there is a question of what now. I mean, like, and in that conversation, one of the things you touched upon where it's like, well, yes, like placement tests maybe have lost that utility, but it's because they were set up.
Yes.
to do what the machine is doing. It's like you couldn't pick a more, apt encapsulation of the sort of algorithmic composition than the placement test, where
Yeah.
it's utterly detached. So I mean, like, there is this sort of, postmodern question of, okay, but so what now, right? It's not enough just to point out the placement test is bankrupt. The
Yeah.
question then, which, it is the postmodern question, it's what now, right? The sloppy critique of postmodernism is that it's only pointing out that meta-narrative has been lost, right? As the sloppy postmodern critique is, oh, well, look, reason didn't get us there and God didn't get us there. Therefore, everything is equivalent. It's like, no. That's not what postmodernism was doing. They were observing, look, meta-narratives have collapsed. What now? And there were a lot of weird answers to that.
Yes.
There's a lot of weird, it's like, okay, well, let's retreat into spiritualism, or well, let's build it on that. It's like, there are a lot of weird answers to that. But the postmodern question is, what now? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, potentially there is a kind of similar question, which is, what do we do now? And it's possible this is a kind of answer to that, right? I mean, and there's an affirmative utility to that beyond just, well, yes, what we've been doing is bullshit. We've been saying that for a while, and now it's come crashing down. So we're left in this position of, okay, but now what?
Yeah.
Is there a possibility that we have a tentative answer to that? It's not going to be, here's how to fix your placement test, or here's what you have to do pedagogically now. But there may be the beginnings of an answer to what now, the exigence of what now. Is that possible?
Yeah. I like the term affirmative utility. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, I still think institutionally, I mean, I was at a reception the other night, and it because, I teach what I teach. And so I oftentimes get asked about that. And then I was like, there's 8 people at the table, and all of them seem to think you could easily catch it. Like,
what are tentative, how so?
The idea, like, if students are using Chat GPT, there's a way to determine if they did it. There's detection software you can use. And I had to be like, I mean, maybe it'll become detectable, but I imagine that's just going to be an arms race where detection is. So I was all to say that I was, we, at least for a certain part of this conversation, we probably don't need to once again affirm how screwed we are. Like, I think that the doomsday news is out for a significant portion of people. Not everybody yet. I think for some people it's, I mean, even for me, I gave a remarks at our faculty retreat about this. And I kind of was saying, like, listen, the idea that students are going to use this to write is like the least of the potential problems with this. Like, the idea that it's going to make students in your class cheat is like an adorable thing to be afraid of with respect to AI generation of text, right? I mean, I'm imagining a world where the legal system is just computers yelling at each other and, spam petitions that just clog up every governmental, anyway, right? Or nobody ever getting paid for everything again, right? The labor market just bottoming out. So to a certain extent, are your students using it is not something that has ever kept me up at night. Anyway, but I don't think that this piece necessarily needs to be doom and gloom, because I think the audience that we're imagining doesn't need that argument rehashed or
But then, I mean, can that be a premise where it's like, it's accepted? We know what this is, it's accepted. So the question then is, what's a productive way forward? If our response isn't, well, shut it down, that's it, do what you want, pull the plug, I'll kill you.
Yeah.
If your response isn't just, all right, well, that's a good civilization we had, but now we're done, which is a fine response. I mean, that's probably going to be our answer anyway.
Yeah.
Whether we want it or not. Uh,
Hopefully the heat gets us before the AI does.
right. But I mean,
I-
if that's not the
yeah.
assumption, it's like, well, then what is?
And I think our argument would be is that we need to, that the what now question is what we want to, like this sort of affirmative utility, but we want to, not but, or let's just say but for now, but we want to pump the brakes before we jump to a sort of technocratic, like we think that one of the things that is needed in this what's now moment is a sort of alternate theoretical framework. So that, I mean, I kind of also like the idea of like, this is the I mean, theory is a practice. It's practical, right? And we think that this is actually the theoretical argument we're making is very practical, which is how do you arrange this debate? There is no more practical a question than that.
Right.
And that's what we think, that's the practice that we need right now is we need to reframe this conundrum around embracing the term artifice. That for us is a utilitarian, practical, affirming move.
Yeah.
This moment, and rhetoric's got the resources, and as folks in rhetoric, that's what we're gonna pull from, right? Whereas we could pull from any number of other places that engage in artifice, creative practice, artistic practice, right? Whatever. We're coming at this from rhetorical. So that could even be how we like this. This is what we have to offer. This is what we think is useful. And there's a tradition and there's history, there's contemporary stuff. But yeah, that's our affirmative utility, which is now my working title for this article.
All right. Well, we're getting close to today. We'll have to wrap up on time.
I've got these notes that are basically rhetoric and artificiality. So I'll type these up. Luckily, I wasn't too tired, so it's mostly legible, but certainly not OCRable. Oh well, this one is. We'll see. I can probably parse this. Maybe I'll put up a hit and say, can Turk transcribe my notes? Has anybody done a romantic comedy predicated on Turk work? You give someone a human intelligence tasks, and it's somebody asking somebody to marry them.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it's like, do you post a thing saying like, find me a wife? But then ultimately it's one of the people who is the gig worker who ends up falling for them sight unseen.
Yeah.
TM.
What's the is it a Shakespeare play where there's the guy, or I don't know Shakespeare, but there's one guy's talking, but there's somebody in the bushes telling him what to say.
Cyrano?
Yeah.
That isn't Shakespearean, but yes.
That's the original Turker.
Well, we only got a couple minutes, but no, we can blue sky this where, so what happens is a person posts the hit, find me a partner, and maybe it's more than one hit. They're kind of iterative, and the person is like, just sort of first, just because it's a well-formed hit, gets on, but then like starts looking for these and is gradually falling in love with the person by proxy, And as conflict, it's like the person has to sort of like make sure that others aren't getting those hits. It's like they have to like winnow it down to where it's just they're the needle in the haystack here.
I think this is something. We'll get Spike Jonze to do it. He did Her, right?
I mean, I'm sure there is some kind of gig economy romantic comedy.
Yeah.
But this is a particular one. Anyway. All right. Well,
that's great. So we got a pretty good brainstorming session and a treatment on a spec script we're gonna write.
Spec script.
Yeah.
We'll have ChatGPT write that. It's already done.
Yeah. All right. And
Um,
then avoid the writer's strike because I don't want to cross a picket line right now. So
well, we're not writing. We're not in the union either.
oh, that's true.
Um,
We're management apparently.
let me ask this: Are we moving forward with this?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll type these notes up. I'll start writing some stuff.
I'll type these notes up.
Yeah, that's something.
Okay.
No, I think maybe thinking about an outline, like what are things we think this in broad strokes, what are the beats of this?
Okay.
Like an introduction that sets up artifice, and then maybe a kind of a survey of the conversation and the way that the term artificial intelligence shows up across the debate.
You type up those notes and we can maybe pull together an outline that
Okay. I'll do the notes in an outline. Yeah.
yeah, or I mean, if you even just post the notes, we can
Okay.
collab on it or whatever.
Great. Okay. Good. Well, then I'm off to make a Cyrano de Bergerac tweet joke about mechanical Turks. So
Don't yeah, I mean, just don't tip the spec script.
no, I won't. This is just like a little unrelated.
I also like the assumption that no one will ever see this video, which is true. This is not a public format.
Yeah, don't tip it on Twitter. I believe we are still live streaming. Cut this.
Only in theory.
Okay. All right.
Right.
We'll have a good one. I'll see you soon.
Yep.